Then we'll be done with 54. So one of these concepts is something that you are probably very familiar with, maybe not as familiar with as you are with some of the other concepts that we've talked about from 54, but this is the idea of food web versus food chain. So food chain versus food web. Okay, and remember, chapter 54 is all about ecosystems, meaning, or all about communities, not ecosystems, but meaning we're dealing with all of the species that are living close enough that they can interact together, including one of the interactions we talked about was predation, right? And so these food chains and food webs are entirely constructed on predation relationships. Okay, so both of these. If you wanted to talk about what is a similarity between the two, other than that they both include food, right? You're like, how are they similar? Well, they both have the word food. You got it, right? They both are built upon predation. Okay, so that's one big similarity between the two. Built upon predation. Another big similarity between the two is they connect ecosystem, or gosh, I keep saying ecosystems, connect communities. I am so sorry. You deserve better than for me to keep saying ecosystems when I mean community. Okay, but they connect communities. They illustrate to you how you could take an entire community and connect it based on these interactions. Now, obviously, it's just some of the interactions because we're not illustrating competition, we're not illustrating facilitation, we're not illustrating herbivory. Although, actually, we do illustrate herbivory in here, but we're not illustrating parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, so it's a relatively simple illustration, but it's an illustration nonetheless. Okay, food chains, the differences now. Food chains contain one representative at each stage. Okay? A food chain contains one representative at each stage. And you're like, what stage? What are we talking about? I'll show you in a second. Okay? A food web, on the other hand, tries to contain all representatives at each stage. So where a food chain is nice, it's simple, it's illustrative of how you move up, to more complex forms. It's oftentimes too simple. Yeah, Mark.
Yes. So basically, what I'm seeing here is that the food chain is basically just a summarized version of the food web.
Yes, and sometimes not even just a summary of it, because a summary of it, you're like, okay, let's pick the best representatives at each stage and move through. Sometimes it's not even that. Sometimes it's not even just a summary, it's just a portion of it. It's just a piece of it. The chain is a piece of the web. Okay? So I want to show you some examples of this. You've already written that down, right? All right. Okay. Here we go here. Look at this. It's a flower. Okay? So here we have one stage of our community. Okay? And this, we'll talk about this more today, but this would be known as the producer because it's producing the first type of organic material. And it's doing that by converting sunlight into chemical energy, right? Okay. And then you've all done this before, right? Food chain, food web. You're like, this is okay. This is okay. I got this. You're like, what eats this plant here? What's going to be? Yeah, look at that. That actually looks pretty good. No, it's not a cloud, Rick.
That's what she said.
It's a caterpillar.
How do you flowers work?
Okay, so here, look at that, 6 legs, right? It's an indication it's an insect. Because that's how they are.
But their butt drags?
Yeah, well, it's got like fake appendages back here. Anyways, that's another story for another time. Okay, so here's another stage, and then here we've got. Yep.
It was songbird.
Okay, and here we've got a bird. Okay, and so we're illustrating this food chain, right? A very simple illustration where we start at this first level where organic material first starts to show up as they harvest sunlight and convert it into chemical energy.
Sorry to interrupt. Dr. Phillips is stuck with me.
Okay.
Thank you.
You bet.
Hi, Gary. Hi, Gary.
Dr. Phillips, I put him up here.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, so here's a food chain. Very simple, just a small percentage of the overall community. And then now to illustrate a food web, we're going to try to include all the representatives at each stage. Okay? So in addition to the flowering plants, although flowering plants is going to account for almost all. Anyways, so here we've got grasses. Okay? Here we've got things that form really beautiful, wonderful trees. Okay? So we're trying to represent all of our representatives at each stage. And then in addition to the consumers that eat these, you've got maybe small mammals. Right? You've got small mammals.
Oh, it's a mouse.
It's a mouse.
I was looking at.
No, relax. Okay, we've got some other insects. And then in addition to birds that are going to feed at this level, you're going to have other small mammals. Okay.
Or like a snake?
I don't know. It is, maybe it is another mouse. Or some other thing, I don't know. Somebody said a snake. Okay, something like that. Okay, and now we have to start illustrating all of these relationships here.
Wait, what?
Whoa.
That's a turtle.
It's some animal, okay? Relax. Maybe it's a snake, maybe it's a turtle, maybe it's something completely different. Yeah, Mark.
But it looks of it seems like other animals can be on multiple parts multiple areas of the food chain.
Absolutely. So you can have, say, some of these, say this bird also feeds on this plant material. Okay? And so now this food web, in addition to trying to represent every individual at all of the stages, it also tries to illustrate all of the feeding relationships. So now it starts to get incredibly complicated, right? And this is a simple community that only includes 3 stages, which in reality, most of our terrestrial stages are, anywhere from 3 to 5, and our aquatic stages are anywhere from 4 to 6 or 7. Okay, and so these can get really complicated really fast. The reason why I did this is I want to show you one additional thing that we can do to make these webs even more complicated, but a way better representation of the community. What do you think? So if we've got, let's say, all of the organisms at this stage, all of the organisms that take sunlight and convert it into chemical energy, okay? So we've already got all of those. We've got all of the organisms at this stage that feed on the organisms that make the organic material for the first time, that take sunlight and convert it into chemical energy, okay? And we've got all of the organisms that eat those organisms and may also eat some of those that are harvesting sunlight. Okay? What could we include in this that's going to complicate this a lot but better represent the community? Because we're missing something. Yeah, Katie.
Like the little, like tiny things.
Okay?
Like
The
vegetables.
Okay, so the organisms that it's like, okay, well, what happens when something up here dies, right? Because it may not be eaten by anything while it's alive, but when it dies, now it's going to get eaten by something, right? So that's one thing we could do is we could include our decomposers, our detritivores, and we'll talk more about those later today, but those are organisms that eat dead organic material, right? So that is something we could do to complicate it, and we're going to put all these up here. So our decomposers and detritivores tend to be single-celled organisms. Bacteria, fungi, other single-celled eukaryotic forms. So I'm just going to draw a cell here, and it's going to be a eukaryote because we've got the nucleus there, and all of these are going to feed into that, right? This is the decomposer, the organism that eats dead organic materials.
Wait, what is that's at the bottom?
No, it goes at the top because it's feeding on this trophic level, but it's also feeding on all the individuals that die here. It's also feeding on all the individuals that die here. It's also feeding on this. It's also feeding on this. It's also feeding on this. And it's also feeding on this. Okay? We've really complicated this food web, right? This is awesome. But now it's a better representation of the community. There's one more thing missing. I didn't even think about that one. That was a nice job, Katie. Anything else missing? So think about our interactions. We've got competition, right? We're not illustrating those interactions, but we've got all our competitors represented, right? If we have all the representatives of every stage, then we have our competitors. We're just not illustrating that relationship. So no, we're not missing those. Okay? Our facilitators. Remember, the facilitators get the land ready for something else. Okay? If we got every representative at every stage, we have them. Okay? The herbivory, right? These are animals that are eating plants. We've got that represented. The parasites and the mutualists, the organisms that live inside other organisms. Right? My goal this year, actually I have two goals. One is to get you to pass the AP exam. The other goal is to get you to see every living thing as a lunchbox for other living things. Okay? That's another goal. So when you look at this, I want you to see this as a lunchbox. And what's inside of a lunchbox? Food, lots of stuff, right? And so inside of this, there's something else in there to eat, right? So when you eat this mouse, you're not just eating the mouse, you're also eating everything else living inside that mouse. Right? And so the parasites. And because a lot of parasites are worms, I will represent these with a worm, okay? So here we have a worm, okay? It is a parasitic worm, and we always put the parasite one stage above what it feeds on. Okay? Because the parasite living inside this mouse, it feeds on the mouse. So we have to put it one stage above the mouse. Because it's feeding on that mouse, and we're representing these stages by feeding relationships. But it's not just this mouse that has a parasite, plus the mouse probably has more than one parasite, right? I mean, there's probably, a couple of worms that feed on that mouse. Okay? But this caterpillar, it's got some parasites. The butterfly, and you're like, is this the same species? It's not the same species, okay? Relax, because if it is, we don't need to draw it twice. But this has some parasites. And guess what? This has even more parasites than this stage, because some of these parasites become parasites for this stage, and it has its own unique parasites, right? And so we've got just lots and 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 lots of parasites, okay? And so this is one aspect of community ecology that very few people think about. I mean, just period. It's basically only parasitologists think about this area of community ecology, which puts you in a really unique place to stand out when you take your AP exam if given an essay question about community ecology, because you're going to think about something that virtually nobody thinks about, except for the other people in this room taking the AP exam as well. In that parasites add to the number of interactions in a food web and are an oftentimes, but sadly and disappointedly, forgotten part of them. But you're going to include them, and you're going to think about them, and you'll talk about them. Isabel.
Our parasite's bad.
Are parasites bad? What do you mean by bad? Parasites do lower the fitness of their host, right? It's a win-lose relationship. The parasite wins, the host loses. However, they don't lower fitness to 0 typically like a predator does, right? Predator eats its prey, that prey's fitness is now 0, right? Dead organisms that are, being digested in their predator don't reproduce. Parasites don't tend to reduce fitness to 0. They may make their host produce less offspring, but they're still going to produce offspring typically. Kyle.
So what if your host only gives off one offspring? Does it just lower it to 0?
Well, so then it would lower the average. So some individuals are going to be 0, some individuals are going to stay at 1, and then so the average, if the average is 1 for the entire, like an entire population, and then you have a different population that has a number of infected individuals, the average may drop to like 0.8 for that population. Like obviously a single individual can't have 0.8 offspring.
Yeah.
But the average can be 0.8. Yeah.
If there's like a female that is having a child, like
Yeah.
can the parasite infest it?
Yes. Yeah, it's actually a very common mode of transmission to pass from mother to offspring. And it really only is an issue for mammals and then for other animals that incubate their offspring. But yeah, you call that transplacental transmission. And it's fairly common. And transmammary transmission is fairly common as well, where you pass it by nursing your offspring. The parasite passes in the milk.
What if predators not want to eat animals and want parasites?
That's a wonderful question. And you would think that the answer is we don't have enough data in that area. We don't have enough data. That's one of my active areas of research. Is I try to look at, do things like ground nesting birds, do they put up with their nest being infested with mites and fleas and other parasites because it lowers the predation on their eggs? I think so, but we need more data. There's some data to support that they'll put up with that, and so their chicks may not grow as fast, and so on average they may not produce as many offspring, but they get eaten way less often. Seems like a win to me, right? Yeah.
Oh, was that the thing with like the baby raccoons getting infected? Because that's like passing from the mother.
Yes. Yep. That is another explanation. That would be approximate explanation for why juvenile raccoons have higher rates of infection than adults, is because the parasite is oftentimes transmitted to the offspring transplacental while it's in the womb and transmammary through lactation. Yeah. All right. So here's what I want you to do. We're going to do a mini lecture break. We're not actually doing a full-on lecture break. I just want you to take maybe a minute, talk about this with those around you, and we come up with some ideas of why these are limited to a certain number of stages. Okay? What is it? So here, let me give you the data. Okay, so here are your observations. Okay, here are your observations. In terrestrial, that's land food webs, you rarely have more than 4 stages. Okay, now if you're going to start to include the parasites, then you'd get a 5th stage, right? But without considering parasites, if you're doing just predation and herbivory, you rarely have more than 4 stages. In really stable aquatic ecosystems and communities, you rarely have more than 6. Okay, so those are your observations. I want you to come up with some explanations. Okay, so those are your observations. Come up with a hypothesis to explain why do we rarely have more than 4 in land communities, and why do we rarely have more than 6, and even that's pretty rare, in aquatic water communities. Alright? Take about a minute, talk with those around you, and see if you can come up with a hypothesis.
Was that the one?
Also, not knowing this kind of more sensitive that more, so she's more
Yeah.
That makes that fair. Bear. Human. Bear. I'm just doing this in
Are you asking why, what, like the numbers are different on land?
You could address it that way, that's fine, because that will force you to take one of the 2 main hypotheses.
Okay.
The other one, you could just say, why are they both limited?
Yeah.
Well, why don't we have more, right? So, alright. Alrighty. So you actually had 2 different observations. One is you observed that there aren't an unlimited number of stages in a community, right? And in fact, it's not even close to unlimited, it's a relatively few. Okay, so that was one observation. You were also given that the numbers are different. That aquatic oftentimes have more than land or terrestrial. Okay, so what are some hypotheses to explain this? Kyle.
We said that the space, so like the space of your community, like the more space you have, so like water is, wide and
Okay.
so because there's so much space, there's more creatures in it, which equals more of
Okay, so let's not just keep it to space. Let's expand that a little bit and say environmental complexity, right? The more complex your environment is, the more stages you could support. Okay, I like that. It's not one of the 2 main, but it's a good hypothesis. You could test it, right? You take maybe 2 land ecosystems, one with higher levels of complexity than another, and see if it supports more stages, right? It's testable, it's falsifiable. Yeah, Mark.
Like just due to the fact that there's so many there's so many different types of creatures in the ocean.
Oh, so you're going with the difference as well. So many different types of organisms. That would be more of like a relationship.
More like diversity.
Yeah, so that'd probably go along the lines of environmental complexity. Yeah, but yes, Katie.
So like both are limited because less energy is transferred between each level and some is given off to others. I mean, it's not lost, but it's given away before the next predator.
I mean, it is lost. It doesn't disappear.
Yeah, it doesn't.
But it is lost in terms of its... Right, in terms of the organisms can't keep it, right? It's lost as heat. Okay? So there's one big hypothesis for why these communities are limited to few stages, and one of them is called the energetic hypothesis. That only a small percentage of the energy available at each stage is available to the next. Is available to the next. And you'll know after next is stage, right? Okay, only a small amount of the energy available at each stage is available to the next. We're going to talk about this a lot in chapter 55. And you guys have already read 55, so you were clued into this concept. The other one, do we have any other hypotheses for why this is? And this one especially comes out of the aquatic versus terrestrial. Mark.
There happens to be like more, or at least like more variety of food down there.
Yes, sure. The higher variety of food, you're going back to the higher variety of forms, right? Because the life forms are what provide the food. Yeah. The other one's called the dynamic stability. Dynamic stability hypothesis. And this is basically that communities are unstable and more stages or levels or trophic levels, more stages increase the instability. So this hypothesis is basically that the reason why there are so few levels is because these communities, they're not static. They're unstable. They change. And because they change, they are unstable. And because they are unstable, they change, right? It's both are true. And the more stages you have, the more instability you have in this community. All right? Do we buy it? Okay. And so these are not what you would call mutually exclusive. They both could be true. They both could provide an explanation for why we're limited to very few levels. All right? Any questions about this? Because we're going to take actually a full lecture break and to finish up 54. Okay. Let me pause the recording. Okay. So this is the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Okay. Now how would we test this? I heard some of you talking about some, novel and unique ideas. I like it. Rick.
Okay, so we take a group of 25 taxa, then we take two groups of 15 taxa and control them the same way.
Okay.
Expose them to the same amount of disturbance.
Okay.
And then we can see the difference between the two smaller ones to see how intense the disturbance is compared to the larger amount.
Okay.
So if we have two smaller, because there's one smaller one that got no disturbance at all, they got the most disturbance. So we can
Okay.
compare.
So and that's fine. The thing that I would caution against is you actually have two variables there then. You have the number of taxa differ and your level of disturbance differs, right?
What?
No. That's the same. We've seen. That's what we're looking for. To see.
You're putting the same level of disturbance and different taxa, and then what are you going to measure?
The intensity.
The intensity of what?
The disturbance.
See, that's what I'm saying. Then it's becoming a second variable, because now you're changing, right? You're changing your number of taxa, and then you're measuring your level of disturbance, which is fine. I mean, that's fine. I just want you to know, so you're not actually subjecting each group to the same level of disturbance, because you're actually measuring disturbance, right? You're measuring. So what you're thinking of disturbance is how does it change your number of taxa, right? That's probably what you would measure.
Yeah.
Okay, Carrie.
So if you kept the same level of disturbance and had a different number of taxa, could you then test the effects on the environment that you're disturbing?
If you kept the disturbance the same and you differed the number of taxa, yeah, but what would you measure though? Would you measure in terms of the change in the number of taxa, or maybe measure it in the number of interactions and how that changes?
Yeah, probably.
Okay. Yeah, and we can do that. It's just this becomes it, and in both these experiments you can do it. It's just now we're starting to wonder, what are we actually measuring? How are we going to quantify our level of disturbance right? In your setup, and in here, how are we going to quantify the impact on the community, right? If we're keeping the number of taxa the same. Trinity, did you have something?
But like, are you able to change the levels of disturbance with the number of taxa and then measure that?
Yeah, well, so you're not going to focus on trying to keep the number of taxa the same. Let's change the levels of disturbance and then count the number of taxa, right? Because now we have a very easy way to quantify the impact on the community. How many taxa are there? How many species are there? How many genera are there? How many families are there? If we change the levels of disturbance, right? So now if we do it that way, now we have a very easily measured impact on the community. How many species are there? Or if there's just way too much diversity, how many families are there? Right? If you don't want to get in and count all the number of species of a particular family of insect, then let's just do families. Okay? And so how could we change our levels of disturbance? The question is, what on earth is disturbance and where does this come from? Okay? First thing I'm going to tell you, and this is a big part of chapter 54, is human disturbance is some of the most intense that a community faces. And there are a lot of ways in which we can disturb a community. We could do it by fishing, right? If we go out and we heavily fish a particular species, that's going to disturb the community. Or like what we were talking about, not yesterday, on Monday, if we eliminate all the predators, remember we talked about why are there so many deer? If we eliminate all the predators, we are disturbing that community. Or if we dump a whole bunch of, soap into a waterway, we are disturbing that community, right? So human disturbance is some of the most intense disturbance that a community faces. So then now we're talking about, okay, well, a disturbance is something that is going to rapidly change the number of a particular species, or maybe of several different species, or it's going to rapidly change the amount of nutrients that are available, something like that. Okay? So how could we test this? If we're going to say, okay, we're going to test this intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And so now, like Trinity says, we're going to change our levels of disturbance and we're going to count the number of taxa. Maybe count the number of families present. Any ideas? There's a suite of studies that has almost revolutionized the study of ecology, and it's controlled burns. Controlled burns. Using fire to destroy a community and then allow it to rebuild. Okay? Rebuild itself. And so you have a number of researchers, a number of ecologists doing controlled burns and like temperate grassland and temperate forest where you go in, you burn the community, which should kill basically everything, and then you allow it to rebuild. And the rate at which you burn, you change. So your level of disturbance changes, right? In one area, you may burn it twice a year. In one area, you burn it once a year, or every 2 years, or every 5 years, or every 10 years. And you see how many taxa are there in that community. And so at our lowest levels of disturbance, you would predict that you would find low numbers of taxa. At your highest levels of disturbance, you would expect that you would find low numbers of taxa. And so now let's try to explain why this is, right? Come up with an explanation for our explanation, right? Our explanation is diversity is highest at intermediate levels of disturbance. But then there's a question of why. Why does low disturbance levels produce low taxa, low diversity as well? The high, it makes sense, right? If we're burning this area twice a year, there's just not enough time for a lot of different species to move in. Does that make sense? Right? If we're burning something twice a year, there's just not enough time for it to rebuild. But what about in low? If we're only burning it once every 10 years? Katie?
Well, when it's low, the taxa that are there, they control a greater percentage of what's happening.
And so what do we call that? What's that interaction that you're describing? If you have certain taxa controlling what's going on. Think about that. What does that mean as far as an interaction that we talked about from 54? Trinity. We've got, so it could, is it because of predation? Do we have a low number of taxa because they're just eating everything else? Competition. The reason why that low levels, the idea here, an explanation for our explanation, a hypothesis for our hypothesis, the explanation for why there's low diversity at low levels of a disturbance is because competition favors the strongest. Okay? That's an explanation for our explanation of why low levels of disturbance have very little diversity. Competition favors the strongest. There may not be an opportunity to partition that niche, and so your diversity is going to be low. Our explanation for why high levels of disturbance have low diversity is disturbance favors the fastest. And I don't mean those that can run the fastest. I mean those that can get to that area fastest. Okay? That make sense? So these are explanations for our explanations. And so we could do controlled burns, okay, to test this hypothesis. Another really cool thing is people have done this work in intertidal areas, and you find that the bigger the rock is, the less often it gets turned over by the tide coming in and out and in and out, okay? Small rocks get turned over rapidly by the water coming in, and big rocks get turned over very slowly. And so what you find is the really big rocks, very few taxa, very low diversity. They don't get turned over very often, and only the best competitors are there. Little rocks get turned over crazy fast, very little diversity. The only species you find there are those that get there the fastest. Intermediate sized rocks have the highest levels of diversity. Okay? They turn over quickly enough that the best competitors haven't had time to get rid of the weaker competitors, but they don't turn over so fast that organisms that take a little bit longer to show up don't have an opportunity to get there. Okay? That make sense? Okay. Cool? Any questions, thoughts, concerns? Because that's the end of 54. That's it. That's it. It was a lot, but it's it. It is a thick chapter. You're right. 55, we're not going to spend as much time on, and 56 we'll spend like 10 minutes on.
Today?
No, period. In our whole experience together. All right. Well, it is time for a break.
Yes, sir.
So you can't have it. All right. So chapter 55. Chapter 55, we transition from community to ecosystem. Chapter 55, we transition from community to ecosystem. And so real quickly, we'll talk about what an ecosystem is. And I want to talk about it in context of what chapter 54 is all about. What is chapter 54 all about? What's chapter 54 all about? Yeah. No, that's 53. Community ecology. It's all about community. So an ecosystem is community plus the non-living material. Whoa. Non-living material. Now community, we talked about that already. We know that community are all of the populations together. Okay? And then so ecosystem is community plus, oh gosh. Is that where you were smiling, Nick?
Yeah.
Non-living material. Yeah.
This is like chapter about the whole thing of ecosystem.
The whole chapter? Yeah, the whole chapter. This is on ecosystem ecology. Chapter 55. Okay. Now, there are two processes that are integral to ecosystems. Two processes that are integral to ecosystems. One is energy flow. Energy flow, and the other one, so notice that this is to the right, it's under this, and the other one is nutrient cycling. Okay? Those are the two processes that are integral to ecosystems. Energy flow and nutrient cycling. What flows? Energy. What cycles? Nutrients. How is a flow different than a cycle? Yeah.
A flow doesn't start or go back to where it started.
Yeah, so a flow is one way. A flow is one way, right? So the energy flows in one direction. The nutrients, they cycle. Okay? So energy flows in one direction. Nutrients, they cycle around ecosystems. Does that make sense? That's a very big difference, and that's something that, as simple as it sounds, is probably the most important thing to understand about ecosystem ecology. Energy flows, nutrients cycle. Okay? Energy flows, nutrients cycle. Now, what is the one-way flow of energy? Where does it come from?
Plants.
Yeah, but where does it come from? Where do the plants get it? There we go. So the one-way energy flow goes from sunlight. And where does it end? This one's a little bit more difficult. Yeah, Emma. Even after there, yeah.
The thing that eats the predator after it dies.
Yes, but remember, energy doesn't cycle though, so that's not releasing that energy. So ultimately, that energy even goes beyond that. It's a one-way flow of energy all the way from sunlight to completely useless energy.
Does it like 10% will keep 10%?
Yeah, 10% of the energy goes to the next
So it'll
one.
just be like the 10th thing that gets it.
But where's that 90% go? Right?
Oh, to like 10%. Oh, actually, I don't know.
Emma.
It's like it's
Well,
I don't know.
some of it is in there. It goes to heat. Okay? Ultimately, energy flows from sunlight to heat. And you're like, well, what is it? Doesn't the sunlight go directly to heat? It does. And it basically flows from a very highly organized form of energy in the form of light, that electromagnetic radiation, all the way to heat, which is a useless form of energy. This is a one-way flow of energy. Nutrients cycle though. Okay? So for example, let's say our nutrient is carbon. Okay? Let's say our nutrient is carbon. And you're like, why is carbon a nutrient? Well, because carbon is one of the most abundant, gosh, that's just never ending. One of the most abundant elements in our body. Almost every single one of the molecules in your body contains carbon if it isn't water, right? You're like, well, what about water? That doesn't contain carbon. Okay, but carbon enters into this in producers as carbon dioxide, right? Do y'all remember photosynthesis? Yeah. Carbon dioxide is one of the reactants of photosynthesis. So carbon comes in as carbon dioxide, goes from that into sugar, goes from that oftentimes back to carbon dioxide, but sometimes from sugar to other molecules. I'm just going to write molecules because it can be a number of different molecules. It could go from sugar into proteins. It could go from sugar into DNA. It could go from sugar into fats. But then ultimately it cycles back to carbon dioxide. Okay, it's very cyclical. And so what's nice is carbon could just stay inside of an ecosystem for literally decades, if not longer. The same carbon atom can just keep getting recycled and pumped back into the ecosystem at a different place. But energy isn't that way. Energy just can't keep getting recycled, because once it becomes heat, it's just lost out to space. And it's gone. It's gone. I mean, it may be trapped and it may warm the globe, right? But ultimately it's unusable. Okay? In that format. Does this make sense? Okay. So, there are a few laws that you learned in chemistry that are going to come back in ecosystem ecology, because remember, this is the community and all of the non-living material. And so now we have to start talking a lot about chemistry in this area of biology. So what are some laws that relate to energy? Do you remember any of these laws that relate to energy from chemistry? Yeah.
Conservation of energy.
The law of conservation of energy, which is basically the first law of thermodynamics. First law of thermodynamics. First law of thermodynamics. This has an application in biology. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, but transformed from one form to another. Okay? So I'm going to write these down. If you want to know what the actual law is, you're going to have to go look it up. Second law of thermodynamics also has a great deal of application in biology. And there are different ways of stating the second law of thermodynamics. Some will describe the second law of thermodynamics as the entropy of the universe is always increasing. You're like, well, that's fantastic. Now you've just made a definition of something with another word. I don't know what it means. Probably a simpler way to think about the second law of thermodynamics is energy tends to convert to useless forms, from more ordered forms to more useless forms, or less ordered forms of energy. Okay, and so we could sum this up as basically the second law of thermodynamics, how this applies to life. I said light because I'm writing sunlight. How this applies to life is it goes from sunlight to heat. A very structured and orderly and energy-rich form of energy to a very
That's what she does. She's like, she has accounting in her background, and so she works for nonprofit organizations. And the most recent place she worked for on 2 separate occasions was the Beverly Hills Cancer Center.
Okay.
So she's basically stealing from Girl Scouts and cancer patients. Awesome.